Welcome everyone this morning. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here on Wurundjeri Burrong land of the Eastern Kulin Nations. This land is sovereign and I want to pay respect to elders past, present and future. I also want to give a big shout out to all the amazing mob who have put this festival together, the Aboriginal people who are here in this room today. It's a really great honour to be here. Before we pick off the panel, I'm really excited to introduce a yarn bomber who's, going to entertain us. Hailing from the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, BB Backhouse, a Bardi Jawi creator who's called Naarm Melbourne home for 10 years, began his creative practice as a classical pianist and composer. BB was awarded a West Australian Youth Award at 21 for his work as a music teacher to young Indigenous people. BB's debut solo publication, More Than These Bones, is due to be released this year. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Timmer. This is an excerpt of a new poem I've written called My Grandmother's Two Brown Hands. Your hands are different now, you said to me, as you fumbled around in your black leather handbag and balanced a Winfield Gold between the bounty of your lips. Your hands are different now. You must use them to survive, not sweeten. From where we sat on your apartment balcony, I could see the terracotta mask of the world was cracking open. And the slow pace of the Birrarung was quickening in its silence, and it was widening between the building that perched us high above the people on the street and all the other homecomings of fear. I am everything without you, but when I was with you, I was more than this. You were a foreign land that I first remember exploring in the Amazonian gardens of your estate at 375 Lock Street. You were wonderful and funny and short-tempered and demanding and elegant and everything a grandmother should be. I never once wondered why it was me you gently poured your soft love into, but Mum would say it was because I look exactly like my grandfather before he was taken from you, before you were ready to say goodbye. And it's funny how the design of fate works in repetitive sequencing, because then it was me who wasn't ready to say goodbye to you. You gifted me with more than your blood and your genes. You gave me a reason to believe in a higher purpose. You held a seat for me at the table in your heart, and you were there for me. You were always there for me. Even when I didn't know I needed you, I guess you simply knew. And that night, as the world and the people went crazy, ordering Chinese takeaway and watching mindless television, we sat side by side, heart to heart, Nan and Golden Child. And when my heart thumped in its exposed chamber, I leaned into the movements your hands were making. You sipped your cup of coffee, puffed your cigarette, and flicked the ash onto the tiled terrace. And you combed your hair in the dread of the little hours of that midnight confessional. And you weaved into the air the message I would take with me through the streets of every city I would visit. The trees and beaches and grasslands of the place we knew as home. The horseshoe drive-through of my apprehension, those words use every part of you to carry yourself. And that was how my whole 27-year-old self became no more solid than a blade of grass in front of your two brown hands. You, the woman who once wrestled me screaming into the world of a showery calm and into my mother's waiting arms, but who, at 7:15 p.m. on the 23rd of March 2018, would wrestle me, still screaming, from your lifeless arms and into safety. Where would my safety be then when it was only with you? Your two brown hands had held me up more firmly and more times than my own two white feet. But I remember every part of you. And how you spoke to me on top of the world when you told me my hands were different and I would need to use them to survive, not sweeten. Well, Nan, I haven't sweetened. I've cured in the brine of my experiences. and I've become not sour, but mature and strong. And I have a taste that leaves a residue long after I've left the tongue of anyone who bites my spirit. And I have survived. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, beyond words, was incredible. I feel really honoured to start in such a powerful way. I will start by just briefly acknowledging the panellists and introduce myself. My name is Timma Ball. My heritage is Balladong Noongar, but I grew up on Bunurong country. I've studied and worked in urban planning, policy, research roles for a number of years, and it's been incredibly exciting to see such a sort of wealth of knowledge from First Nation mob really getting in the industry and celebrating our voices and really changing things up a lot. Today, it's really exciting to have Alison Page joining us remotely and Sarah Lynn Rees. I will introduce them briefly before we kick off for some, I think, really exciting discussion. Oh, also, I just want to acknowledge that unfortunately Brian Martin can't be with us today. So, Alison Page is a Walbanga and Wadi woman and is an award-winning designer and film producer whose career spanning 22 years links Indigenous stories and traditional knowledge with contemporary design. She is the co-author of a new book, Design Building on Country, which explores Indigenous design, architecture and engineering principles as a blueprint for Australian design. Sarah Lynn Rees is a Palawa woman descending from the Trawlaway people of northeast Tasmania. She is a lecturer at Monash University, associate at Jackson Clements Burrows Architects, where she also is a lead Indigenous advisor, architecture and design. She is program advisor and curator of the Blak Architecture series for M Pavilion, a director of Parla, Women Equity Architecture, and a member of the Victorian Design Review panel for the Office of the Victorian Government Architect and co-chair of the Australian Institute for Architects First Nation Advisory Working Group. So to kick off our discussion, I actually want to read a really beautiful section from Alison Page's book, which is co-written with Paul Memmott. I think it really just sets up everything we want to discuss today about the role of Black design, culture, and our voices, really beginning to lead how we should be thinking about the future of cities, suburban, and regional development in the nation. I could never give you a blueprint for defining Aboriginal architecture because Aboriginal architecture is a verb, not a noun. And it is in the doing that you understand it. In time and with more opportunity for expression, our understanding of first knowledges will deepen and their convergence with the contemporary world will lead to new thinking that I could never predict, especially when the process is being led by great minds in the field. The Aboriginal architecture industry, if it is healthy, will accommodate many different and upcoming Indigenous voices. They will need time and space to debate and find natural resting places. And I am not sure that the situation will be fixed anytime soon. If your starting point is, as Paul has so beautifully articulated, an architecture that is ephemeral and a secondary element in the cultural landscape, and your destination is Aboriginal architecture in a fixed Western paradigm, then Indigenous practitioners certainly need to define their own ways of working that fulfil their cultural obligations and steer the whole of Australia to a place that at least tries to address some of the issues associated with colonial landscapes. When I was reading this book, I was just so struck by this paragraph, particularly the idea that architecture is a verb and not a noun. And I think it really speaks to the idea that for First Nation people, it's not this sort of static, clean and cut process. I thought I would throw to Alison first. It would be amazing to hear more of your thoughts about the beautiful words you've said in this book. And maybe if you wanted to start by speaking to this book and how it evolved and maybe some of the processes, and just generally talk about your work too.
So much, Shima. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boorong lands. I'm zooming in from Gumbaynggirr country in Coffs Harbour. I'd also like to welcome COVID onto the panel today. I'm suffering it quite greatly right now. So I've got my tissues, I've got water, I've got drugs pretty close by. But it's really nice to be part of Black and Bright, even though I might be a little bit black and foggy. We'll see how we go. Yeah, look, thanks. It was COVID actually that sort of led to, to this writing this book. It was when we went into the first lockdown in March 2020. I'd already sort of agreed to be part of this First Knowledges series that, because at the time I was making films about Aboriginal science, and Thames and Hudson had got wind of it, and we sort of developed this series. And the first book in the series is Songlines by Margot Neal and Lynn Kelly, which is amazing. I think, every artist in Australia, or every Australian should read it, because, songlines are the greatest inheritance of this nation. There's my book and Paul's book. It was really great sort of reconnecting with one of my mentors to write that. And then the third book in the series is A Country by Bill Gamage and Bruce Pascoe. And there's 8 of them, I think, lined up. So it's actually a celebration of traditional knowledge, which is sort of what I've been pretty obsessed with. It was really good to stop and actually think, because I've been so busy doing and practicing in a way that to think about our philosophy, and a lot of things just sort of clicked for me. Suddenly understanding songlines, and how our people, if we didn't have the written word, how did we remember this vast amounts of, ecological and cultural data that allowed us to survive the Ice Age without writing it down. So all of this scientific data, how we did it was to write really elaborate stories. And the more elaborate, the more memorable, obviously. And then embed those stories into geographic locations and into objects. And so as we walked through country over time, we were uploading and downloading all of this information. So, that was understanding that and getting my head around that, because we've heard this provocative term songlines for a long time, but it's very misunderstood. But this is a system of mnemonics that, I'm sure for every writer in the room, this is why now, architectural teams, I think, should be collaborating with writers, artists, all sorts of different practitioners in order to explore this idea that if we're going to build on country, then what we're building on is a library. So we either mute those stories by building over them and, putting your hand over someone's mouth, or we ask ourselves as designers and architects, how can my new layer of the city or the country town, or even my new object, how can that addition to country, because even all things material and man-made are part of country, they're of country and they're part of country, extension of country, how can they amplify and preserve the system of songlines that have allowed our people to successfully live on this continent for 65,000 years? And how can my new layer be an invitation for all people to understand the stories of this continent, because until you understand the stories of the continent, you will never truly belong here.
Wow. Thank you so much. I think what you said about the idea of architecture and infrastructure on country being like a library, housing songlines and stories of who the people, the original inhabitants of this continent are, is so powerful and such an exciting way to think about the future of where we're going to be. I would love to ask Sarah what you think about this. And I think similarly, you have this really amazing career spanning sort of working in research, completing a master's philosophy at Cambridge, working in practice, running sort of similar workshops and programs at Pavilion. Yeah, I would love to know your thoughts on this and yeah, kind of what you're doing in practice.
I'd like to say thank you to Alison. That was beautiful. Yeah. And I don't think I've ever had the words to be able to articulate that. And I think you've given us those words, your words, to be able to articulate it. So thank you so much. I probably operate more at the systemic, what kind of world do we live in? What are the systems that we operate in and how do we change them? And I hope that, like, operating at two ends of those scales, hopefully we can meet in the middle and create better futures. But I guess for me, I'm quite interested in the foundational reason of why our systems have been set up the way they have, be that architecture, be that all systems in the built environment, and how can we particularly observe them in the first instance and then figure out where the power or trigger points are where we can include or flip the switch on something to create more systemic change in the future. So that's been the focus of mine for the last few years. And it's particularly been wonderful to work as part of the First Nations Advisory Working Group to be able to do that and have a collective of Indigenous voices informing, we know where those trigger points are, but how should they change? Because it can't just be one person's perspective, it has to be a collective voice. And so for me, that's, we're all indebted to the decades of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who have been advocating and researching and publishing and writing in terms of architecture, because it's now led us to this space where we can have these kind of conversations and our profession is listening. So for me, it's now where are those trigger points where we can actually create that change. So an example of that is there's a lot of acronyms here, sorry. There's the National Competency Standards for Architecture as a document that governs what it means to be an architect. It defines what architecture schools have to teach, what you have to prove at the point of registration, and what all of your ongoing professional development is based on. And historically, that document's had no Indigenous content whatsoever. And over the last 2 years, we've been working in partnership with the AACA, who is the organisation that owns that document, to include First Nations criteria, so performance criteria. So now every architecture school in Australia is trying to indigenise their curriculum, and I take heed in Alison's words. It's going to take time to get it right, and it's going to take time, and we're going to make mistakes along the way, and we need to have patience and kindness towards each other while we go through that process. And also we need a lot of non-Indigenous practitioners to understand, I don't know, I keep saying stay in your lane, but I don't know if it might be a little bit too aggressive.
No, I think that's reasonable.
But, we need that time and space, as Alison said, to yarn amongst ourselves and define, well, what does designing with country mean? And, what does all of these things actually mean from the context of an architectural or a built environment perspective? We've all got our own versions of that, but if we're then imparting that on the world and giving a tiny bit of agency to all practitioners to be able to then go on and appropriately partner with the voices of country, so those who have the cultural authority, then we need to be able to give them the words and the tools to find their own way in. It's like I'm teaching a class at the moment and we're focusing on these performance criteria as a bit of a test case. Well, how do we actually roll this out into the curriculum? And it's interesting to see the young people coming up now, a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And some of them can really relate to it even though they're not Indigenous. So we talk about cultural safety. And if you can relate it to your own personal circumstance, however you identify and feeling culturally unsafe, then you can start to understand how it might feel for an Indigenous person and also how the system operates in that way. Like the best way I think I've come up with so far to even articulate this is that we don't live in a historical colonial society. So when we talk about colonisation, it's not an event that happened in the past. We live in a settler colonial structure, which means that it is ongoing. And it means that almost all of the systems that we operate within in the Western context still prevent or put up barriers and put up ways that stop our people from being able to be the leaders and be the ones who are defining what the rules are. So that's, I guess, coming full circle, that's why I'm quite interested in understanding those systems and figuring out where those trigger points are to go, no, we need to break it here and mend it so that it aligns more with the way that we need to work for the future.
Thank you. No, again, I think a key aspect of change and ensuring that we can indigenise the future of cities and places is education. So that is really exciting. Alison, I just wanted to check in. I think you mentioned that you had some slides that you were going to show. If that's not the case anymore, that's cool too.
Yeah, I do. I do.
But yeah, it would just be great. I just thought, and I'll ask Sarah too, I'm also just really interested to, learn a bit more about practical or just some examples of stuff that's going on. And it would be amazing if you wanted to.
I'd love to
speak
share.
to a project.
But I'll just riff off what Sarah was saying about the process and sort of blowing up the process in a way. Hang on, that's not what I want to show. Hang on, that's not what I want to show either. Go back.
It looks beautiful.
Yeah. The thing that's happened in New South Wales. So I used to work with Dylan Combermary and Kevin O'Brien, right? In the late 90s. We didn't know really at the time what the hell we were doing, because there wasn't really, we sort of thought our traditional architecture was sort of like, not sort of, how do you find the clues in that to sort of develop a set of principles and apply them to this settler colonial system that Sarah's sort of talking about. So we would sort of look at, something like the boomerang, right? So we'd go, okay, well, look at the design of it. It's got a sophisticated design. In fact, if you cut a returning boomerang, cross-section of it, that's the same cross-section that you see in the wings of, A780s and, huge planes, it's the world's first aerofoil. So in terms of functionality, we had a very sophisticated understanding of efficiency and functionality, and we were into it, right? Because even when new materials came into country, like the Kimberley glass points are a really good example, we built new cultural mechanisms to kind of put it as part of our religious beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, because they were just so efficient. It was like, yeah. So we've actually got a very adaptive culture. So it's very functional, very aesthetic, so talking about aesthetic in our culture is extremely important, because don't forget it's part of the song lines. So the more memorable, the more interesting, the more elaborate the stories, and the more intricate the carvings, the more you remember. That remembering is a matter of life and death. So art for us, when you look at an object like this, the stories that are carved into it are purely like a highly functional. It's not decoration. It's not wallpaper, right? So looking at these principles, it's functionality, it's sustainability, obviously, because we care for country, it's aesthetic, and it's story. And I've already kind of talked about songlines, but that is why objects and country become animate. They become a member of the family. Some of the stuff, so when Dylan and I, all of these conversations that we kind of had over the last 20 years, Dylan's now created this regulation in New South Wales where all major developments must integrate country. So that is you know, first of all, the industry's like crapping itself and going, what's country? You know, so we talk about land, sea, sky, country, but now we want to sort of talk about some of these more sophisticated nuances as to how our people view the material world. So yes, it's our library. So as we move through country over time, we remember. This is an image of a man, Frank Gumanamana, it's a beautiful film that shows at the National Museum. And as he's making the fish trap, he's telling the story. So he's like saying, he's talking to the fish trap like it's a person. And this is the way our people, you know, when Bibi was talking about his, you know, his grandmother, it's like, you know, we are a very loving and affectionate culture. We're extremely loving and affectionate, especially when it comes to our family and our community. And we extend that to country and to, you know, to the things around us, because we have this preciousness embedded into it, because we have this compulsion to care for it. So we care for country like we would a family member. We long for it, we sing to it, we talk to it. So this Franco Manamana, when he's making this fish trap, he's saying, you made this river here. And when I go to this river, I do this, da, da, da. So it's more than just remembering. It's ceremonial. The act of making is ceremonial because it's so embedded with our art and our story. So the project I wanted to share is actually a really old project. This is a project that Dylan and I and Kevin worked on in the late 90s. This is at Wilcannia Hospital, but I think it says a lot about our values, because this was a project, and at the time it was a very rare thing for Aboriginal people to be given control over the design of a hospital, right? But, you know, Wilcannia's got like 80%. I'm making that stat up. I just made it up. But it's like a lot of people in Wilcannia are Aboriginal, right? So they gave the control and governance of the creation of this new hospital to blackfellas. So when we went in there, we thought, oh, you're going to want to knock the colonial building down straight away, because, you know, it addressed the streetscape, it turned its back to the river. But no, Aboriginal, no, they had this connection to this hospital because their relatives were born there, people died there, you know, so they had animated, you know, through story and through memory and through connection, this object, this building. And so they wanted to lovingly restore it, you know, which to us was sort of like, oh, I don't get it. It's a colonial building, you know, let's destroy it ceremonially. But then they started talking to us about, you know, this building like it was party. It was their river cod. And so I think back to, I didn't get it at the time because I didn't know about songlines, but they, in the same way that Frank Gumanamana is talking to the fish trap, they are talking to us about this building like it's a family member, like it's a person. And so we weren't talking about roofs and walls and windows and all the stuff that, you know, you sort of go through when you're talking about, especially a hospital too, like, you know, there's a prescribed Western way of looking at a hospital. So we were talking about skins and fins and gills and, you know, the idea that this building would address the river so that you had this spiritual health, you know, you could go out onto the veranda, you know, there was on the right-hand side there, you can see the mortuary. We had to separate that from the main part of the building where people were sleeping, but the health department didn't want us to do that because, you know, it goes against regulations. So what we did to resolve that and to reconcile that was to just put a breezeway between. So it's got the same roof, but a breezeway between. So we could kind of reconcile these two different value systems and then create this camping ground around where you can see on the right there, so people could camp there and do business for 3 months. So I think it's a really, and then the other aspect of, a very important aspect of it was that we created were 6 Aboriginal apprentices. I love the bum crack in that shot there. I've just noticed that. I had to say that. Love a bit of bum crack. But 6 Aboriginal apprentices who knew how to care for this building, that lived there and care for it, because we knew with a lot of housing in remote communities that was part of the issue. There was no connection. Someone would just be parachuted in there to build something and then leave. The community started an earth brick company that created the bricks, beautiful stabilised earth bricks, that they then started building all the houses out of as well, and so they could care for them. So I look back on that project and I understand more about it now that I understand the idea that objects and inanimate objects have spirit. In a lot of Aboriginal languages, we don't have verbs, nouns rather, they're verbs. So even words and a lot of Indigenous people across the world actually have that. It's really interesting that, it's about the sort of action of the wind through the leaves in the tree that describes the word for leaf or tree, rather than there's a leaf, there's a tree, so it's our relationship with it and the motion of it. And so, I find that, but, like Dylan creating that law for all, developers to integrate country into their design, it's freaked the industry out. At the moment, they're all just crapping themselves, and we'll get everything from, I'm working on a project at the moment where we're working on a project with multiple buildings, and we're writing it like we're writing a film. So each building is a character in a film, and it's part of this narrative that as you travel from building to building to building, it's like a film where the character unravels to you, and so, it's a family, and the characters in the family all have a relationship. It's a really, for the architects that I'm working with, that's a pretty out there sort of idea, but they're really into it because it's actually helped them clarify what they're doing as far as the aesthetic goes. It's a decision-making framework, just like filmmaking, just like art making, just like anything. Like once you've got that, the nub of the story, then you sort of know what opportunities there are in terms of creating a relationship between the audience and the thing.
No, absolutely. And thank you so much for giving us such an amazing physical and material and emotional example of what these Indigenous architecture projects actually are. Because I think often the non-Indigenous industry does get a little too swept up in the idea that it's an aesthetic, and you clearly shown that it's not, because the mob there were really attached to a colonial building because that had stories and life to it. And so Blak design, Blak architecture isn't just, physically, materially, aesthetically putting some black art on a building. It's much more deeper and complex and about relationship building. Sarah, I'd love to throw to you now. I know you've done so much as well, and it would be amazing for you to talk about a project you've worked on as well. Obviously the example you was mentioned before, the educational space you're working in is so valuable and important too. But if there was another project you wanted to speak to, or more examples of your work in education too.
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 key projects that might be useful in this conversation. One is a fit out. It's an interior fit out for a university in an existing building for an Indigenous fellowship program. So it's First Nations led. They wanted a First Nations. Actually, the brief required an Indigenous architect, which was the first time I've ever seen that before. But that was their value set, and that's what they wanted. And I think that project gave us an opportunity because they were the client, even though the university is technically the client, they are the client. It gave us an opportunity to start the conversation with what are the values of your organisation. And at that time, there were 3 traditional owner groups and there hadn't been a recognised Aboriginal party for that location. So we were engaging with all 3. And so the project became this process of first understanding the values of this organisation and then turning those into design objectives and measuring ourselves against those at every point, but also working with the traditional owners to understand how we could embed country in a project where we can't use those typical means like language or art or any of those sorts of things. So it was actually really interesting to be given the licence to go and do that. And we proposed a whole lot of ideas to the traditional owners. It became this sort of two-way street of going, well, can we embed, like if we understand the geology and the flora and the fauna, but what are the cultural practices that connect them, and how does this relate to the values of the organisation that we're working with? So the whole project became a premise of we need to reflect the country that we're on, but we also need, because there's a lot of Indigenous people from different nations coming to this space, we need a way for them to be able to connect back to where they've come from too, in a way that's culturally appropriate and safe. And so we did a whole lot of exploration about how we could physically and tangibly embed the materials of country into a project so that they could then be layered with understanding and meaning of the people that came to that site. But we didn't necessarily have to put a plaque up to embed that story. It was this thing that if you know, you know, and if you don't know, then you can listen. And then a whole lot of sort of celebrating Indigenous knowledge, but also another key part of that was that one of the values of the organisation was overcoming the socio-economic barriers that prevent Indigenous people from achieving what they would like to do in life. And so we had a whole sort of material and contractor selection framework that was written into the contract of the builder, which they had to sign, which was fun. Again, one of those power moments. We had a social procurement plan, which we've probably all heard of in the context of architecture, but we made it more than that. And put it in their contract. So they had to sign up to privileging Indigenous suppliers. They had to sign up to understanding that materials of country are important and they can't just change them out as part of their VM process. So I think that project became an exercise in understanding the micro of an actual project and being given the licence to go, actually, no, this is an opportunity for us to change something and to try something new. So that project is still being constructed at the moment, so I can't wait for it to be open and for us to be able to go there. But it was, there are heaps of key elements in it, but maybe the main one is this welcome circle. And so the organisation, they have a process of inducting people into their program. And part of that is being welcomed on country, and that sort of happens outside of that space. So we needed a space within their own floor where people could connect to where they come from and to connect to the country that they're on. And so we worked with the traditional owners and we talked about this idea of message sticks and the idea that they're sent out to call people in or the other way around, but it's done without malice and it's done with the intent of safe passage. And so we've designed this element into the project that is essentially 360 degrees, so one message stick for every degree of a circle, so that you could put down a map of Australia, Indigenous Australia, and the Pacific and Aotearoa as well, because it's representing Indigenous nations from all of those locations. And as part of the induction process, a woven sleeve gets placed on the direction of where you've come from. So if ever you need to go back and feel grounded, you're grounded on the country that you're on because the building reflects it, but you're also able to connect back tangibly in a direction towards the country that you're from. And over time, these message sticks will collect a series of woven sleeves that will allow people, both the organisation, to map all of their relationships and to recognise all of those people who have contributed and made change through the program, but then also allows those people to come back in and know that there's a piece of them always in that space, or a piece of their country always in that space. And so that was a really wonderful project, and there's so many other aspects, and I really can't wait for it to be alive and ready to go. But the other one, which, as working in architecture, you sort of have to always find solutions to problems, and you're subject to regulations, and there's all these systems that are, some of them unknown and unnameable, that you hit yourself up against. And we very rarely get the opportunity to work in the context of art. But Ngawi Caroline Briggs, who's a senior Boonwurrung elder, and I were recently commissioned to do an exhibition at ACCA. And it closes today, so, if you want to go. Today's the last day. But we've been talking and yarning for a really long time, and the conversations we've been having are asking the questions, can you see yourself reflected in the built environment? And part of belonging is being able to see yourself reflected. And people will see themselves reflected in different ways, but we've been yarning for a really long time about what all those different ways might be, and how in projects we can layer up all of those understandings so that there's something for everyone. So for some people that might be the yarning circle, even though every project seems to have a yarning circle now. And for some people that might be language, and for some people that might be hearing a magpie. Because the habitat of that environment is conducive to magpies calling up the sun in the morning. It's so diverse in terms of what it could mean. But in the spirit of art, where you get to ask a question and just sort of leave it open rather than finding a solution, we went down the route of materiality as one aspect of that. And asking the question, if our public spaces were made from the materials of country, what would those materials be? And, I work in practice, and we quite often specify the same 3 or 4 timbers, the same 2 or 3 stones for various different projects. And I wanted to know why, and also where they come from. But more wider than that, I wanted to understand, what is, not the aesthetic, because I don't think that's necessarily the right word, but what is the material identity of country? And what does it mean to actually use these materials? So the exhibition has 55 items that are a selection of 26 stones, 26 timbers, 12 or 13 stones, and a whole lot of materials that component parts are made from materials of country, so glass and bricks, and a lot of that process, including going right from the in-ground clay to the refined clay to the pressed brick to the fired brick, all of those are represented in some way. But for me, it opens up so many questions that I don't have the answers to, and I don't know if I'll ever have the answers to. But, we start to talk about extraction. Is it appropriate to extract all of these materials for their use? What values and ethics are being around those? Are we taking more than we need? Are we replacing that? Are we destroying habitats in the process? Yes, we can sustainably source many of these materials, but what is the definition of sustainably sourcing, and does that have an Indigenous perspective that's grounding it, or is it literally numbers? We've taken this many trees, we've planted this many trees, but we all know that trees are alive and talk to each other, and we all know that they're homes for so many of the living beings in our country. They themselves are living. So what becomes our responsibility to honour those materials if we take them out of country and put them somewhere else? Or if we bring in materials from other people's countries or other countries from around the world, what are we doing? And what is our responsibility, and how do we honour those materials if they have cultural significance? We need to build buildings. That's the reality we live in now. We're not going back to not building buildings. So we need to figure out how we feel about this grey area and make sure that we're operating in a code that allows Indigenous people to feel comfortable with the processes that are happening, because we are extracting materials from country. But then also, what are the opportunities? How can using these materials contribute to the re-identification of country in the built environment? To me, I would love it so much. If you look at the geology maps of Melbourne, there's sort of a stretch of Victorian volcanic plain that comes through, and the rest is Gippsland plain, and they're very two different material identities. And imagine if you walked around the streets and you could read country in the built environment. You could understand that you're moving from basalt country to you're moving to water country, you're moving to all of these different places, and our buildings tell that story, rather than as Alison said, putting your hand over your mouth and choking those stories from coming to life. Yeah. And materials is one very small part of that. But we had the opportunity to explore that in some detail. So, and also we only use methods that you can use in the built environment practice, so nobody could say, oh, it's too hard.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, it's incredible to hear what you've been doing, and Alison too. yeah, I feel really reassured in some way that there's some amazing work happening. One thing I would love to ask you both, I think it's really important. From my experience working in this sector, one of the big issues is often the sense of what non-Indigenous people's responsibility is, and I think one of the challenges is that, as you've both spoken to, architecture, planning is inherently a process of colonisation, and that means as practitioners, most of the time we're going to be working with non-Indigenous folk, and often they're going to have more of a stake because they're property owners of the project, or it's like a very government-led process. But at the same time, I do feel like there's so much genuine goodwill and people just really quite constantly being like, what should we be doing? How can we work better? So yeah, I'd just love to hear some of your thoughts on what best practice, what the future of collaboration between First Nation mob and, yeah, non-Indigenous people in this space might look like. If you can, unfortunately, be a little bit brief, because yeah.
I'm gonna use an example of one project I really wanted to do in Melbourne was free Williams Creek, because this idea of choking all of the creeks and rivers in cities and just putting them into drains, basically underground, is so ridiculous, to me. And it's such an that is the choking thing. So it's about story, but it's also a functional thing. So my message to property owners, to governments, to non-Indigenous practitioners is let us come into the very beginning of the project and be bold. This idea of freeing these rivers and creeks, so that we get a sense, what Sarah was saying before is like, if you want a sense of country, then water is going to flow where it wants to flow. Look at Lismore. It's always going to. So don't stop putting it into drains and thinking that you can engineer it, because you can't. So letting it breathe, be bold, like there's projects I'm working on at the moment where we're allowing the site to flood because it wants to. And so we're designing it that way.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say building on that, we ran a studio in partnership with the Birrarung Council last year, and that was the same kind of conversation. It's we now have an act that gives voice to the Birrarung Council as a living entity. Sorry, the Birrarung as a living entity, which is the Birrarung Council, and the talking to students, actually all non-Indigenous students that were in my studio. The conversation started over what is. Like, if we consider this river as alive, which we do as Indigenous people, but it was a new concept to non-Indigenous people, what rights does it have? Does it have the right to flow? Does it have the right to flood? Does it have the right to nurture? Does it have the right to be nurtured? Does it have the right to be a home? Does it have the right to cause harm? Does it have the right to heal? Like, all of these sorts of questions, which are not conversations that you typically have in an architecture practice, but they're conversations that we need to have. But for me, that in answering your question, I think that, or think I'm answering your question, I don't know, I've gone off on a different tangent in my brain, I'm not sure if I'm coming back to where you started.
Really relevant.
Is that for me, the biggest change that we could have, there's probably two key big changes that would create bigger change at scale and better change at scale. And I think one of those is that every single brief needs to embed the laws and values of country that you're working on. And so if we take the waterways as an example, the country that we're on, the traditional owners often talk about don't harm the waterways and don't harm the children. Well, clearly we're harming the waterways. So how do we free those waterways, as Alison said? But how do we actually live those values in what we're doing? Even if the project has absolutely no Indigenous engagement, no Indigenous consultation, wouldn't it be amazing if our planning system required us to respond to the values and laws of country, and planning engaged with traditional custodians to embed that into the law? So for every project on that country, there is a doctrine or a document that says these are the laws and values of this country, you must abide by these and you must demonstrate how you're doing it. So in terms of going back to your question, what is our responsibility? we're visitors, right? This is not my country. Every single person, unless you're Wurundjeri in this room, we're a visitor to this country. So that means we need to abide by the laws and values, especially if you've been welcomed onto country. You're given those laws and values as part of that welcome process. You will understand, you need to take time to understand them and understand what they mean, but then translate them to every single aspect of your life, including our role in building and constructing on country. And, you know, obviously there's a fine line between appropriate and appropriation, and using them beyond that context wouldn't be appropriate. But if there's a genuine engagement process to embed those into planning and to embed those into every brief, then I think that we will start from a better place, because we will start from country rather than trying to add country in to a system that doesn't understand it.
Absolutely. That's really true. And it's a beautiful way to start wrapping up. Unfortunately, yeah, we are nearly at the end of this session, so we probably won't have a chance to do audience questions. That said, I think for those wanting to know more, grab a copy of this book. I think it's just contains so much incredible ideas on how we build and live on country. And as we wrap up, maybe if both of you, it would be amazing to hear, I guess, just more broadly, like we're living in very complex environmental times, like we're in a pandemic, we're in a extreme climate catastrophe. I'd love maybe just a little, your own sort of hope for the future and like what you're doing and something you're hopeful for. Alison, if you'd like to.
Oh, I just think that it's beyond aesthetic now. So yes, if we want to have cities and towns in this country that, as Robin Boyd said, aren't secondhand American and secondhand England, right? So, you know, that is the aesthetic thing, you know, that's all fine. But now, you know, with what's happening, you know, with climate change, you know, with Lismore flooding, you know, it's actually really, you know, important, I think, for the world to listen to Indigenous people, because we are incredibly good at adaptation, you know, adapting our culture, our spiritual beliefs, our societies are not divided into these taxonomic sort of different groups. It's about the holistic order. And I would hope now is the time to start listening to Aboriginal knowledge keepers about, you know, how the hell are we going to, you know, design our way out of this?
I'd say that that everyone needs to start, if they're not already doing it, being introspective first. I say this to my students, I need you to know who you are, where you come from, what your value set is, and then I need you to question it. I need you to make sure it's actually yours and not something you've inherited or something you've learned without questioning. And then once you've come to a position on certain things, you'll understand why you're reactive to something or why something triggers you. And if you can go through this process, and it's an ongoing, lifelong process, then you understand what your biases are, and you understand that you can suspend them in order to, if you don't suspend them, they'll prevent you from being able to listen. And if they cloud your head and if they're making your head fuzzy, then you're not going to be able to be open to country, open to communities or cultures that are other than your own. So everybody needs to go through that individual process within themselves first, and they need to make an active choice. And that means no more willful ignorance. That means no more excuses of, oh, I never got taught this at school or whatever it is. It's like, no, work on yourself first. And when you've worked on yourself, then we're ready to have a conversation. Because if you go too far into the conversation without someone knowing what their own biases are, it creates more harm.
No, absolutely. Thank you both so much for having such an exciting conversation this morning. I feel like I've learned a lot myself, and I've been working in this sector for so long, and I'm just really going to take so much in terms of building the future with what is in some ways a Western form, but embodying that as a library that carries our songlines is just so incredible and powerful. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.